Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Toxic Floodwaters, Protecting Communities and Their Water Resources from Extreme Weather and Chemical Disaster. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Center for Progressive Reform and Waterkeeper Alliance. I'm Brian Gumm, the Communications Director at the Center for Progressive Reform. Advance to the next slide, please. CPR is a think and do tank with a network of more than 60 member scholars and staff. We're working to build thriving communities on a resilient planet. We drive just, equitable policy reform with rigorous and accessible analysis designed for policymakers, advocates, and the media. I'll now introduce today's panelists and then turn the webinar over to David. Our first panelist is Jordan Macha, the Executive Director and Waterkeeper at Bayou City Waterkeeper in Houston, Texas. Jamie Brunkow, the Senior Advocacy Manager and James Riverkeeper at the James River Association of Virginia, is also joining us today, as well as Victor Flatt, who is a CPR member scholar and professor at the University of Houston Law Center. I'm now going to turn things over to David Flores, a Senior Policy Analyst here at CPR and today's moderator.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome everyone. Today's webinar is focused on the growing threat that climate-driven pollution and chemical disaster pose to our water resources and the communities that depend on them. I am so excited to welcome the large number of participants in today's webinar, including the many members of the Waterkeeper movement. And I want to thank again our co-sponsors with the Waterkeeper Alliance, not just for their co-sponsorship of today's webinar, but also for all the work they do and their allyship in addressing these climate and water threats. I hope that you will share the recording of this webinar with your colleagues and that you will join us for the next webinar in this series on October 20th, which will focus on environmental health and community and neighborhood level strategies. So the first question for today's discussion, I want to direct to our two keepers, Jamie and Jordan, in that order. How have climate impacts and chemical disasters factor into your work as a waterkeeper? And can you tell us about the impacts on water resources and the communities in particular within your watersheds?
Certainly, thanks, David. Again, my name is Jamie Brunkow. I'm with the James River Association. I'm the James Riverkeeper and Advocacy Manager. And just a quick bit about our organization. So I work on policy and Riverkeeper initiatives, but we have a large organization that focuses in a lot of different areas. And I wanted to say just a bit about some of the other things we're doing, maybe somewhat outside of the policy sphere, to really focus on climate change and some real serious threats that we see in our watershed. First off, the James River watershed is 10,000 square miles. It's a large chunk of the drainage that goes into the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We've got about a third of Virginia's population that lives within the James River watershed. And so we've got some major population centers to consider when we're thinking about how climate change is really going to affect our cities and our society. We have a lot of restoration work that we are embarking on now. We actually just received a $1 million grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation that's going to enable us to kick off something called the Living Shoreline Collaborative and really try to focus on implementing more resilient shoreline stabilization projects that will essentially allow for that more natural migration of wetlands as we face what we know will be advancing sea levels in the next 50 years plus. And so we're excited to be able to kick that off and to really focus on public and private land to help prepare our river communities for sea level rise. That all sort of aimed at protecting our shorelines, protecting our communities, but also helping to meet some pollution reduction goals that we are all shooting for in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We've got a TMDL, a total maximum daily load, that applies to all the Chesapeake Bay states. And we've got our own goals within the James River watershed to achieve more linear feet of shoreline stabilization, essentially things that are not riprap, but those more living, nature-based concepts that are going to allow us to adapt to sea level rise, but also trap nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment pollution making its way into the bay. So we are at about 56% of that goal, which has been set to achieve by 2025. So we're embarking on this effort to sort of maximize the amount of implementation we can do towards that goal in the next 5 years or so. Turning more to the idea of policy and spills and chemical disaster, we've been really fortunate at the James River Association to link up with David Flores and the Center for Progressive Reform. I guess I want to sort of acknowledge up front that often spills issues may not come to the forefront until there actually is a spill, and we're being sort of reactive to the problem. We've certainly encountered that as an issue in the James River watershed. I've been with the organization for about 9 years. In 2014, we had a oil train carrying Bakken crude oil derail in downtown Lynchburg, actually really a few hundred feet from our Lynchburg office, and caught the river on fire, dumped the contents of the crude oil tanks into the James River. And that really ignited a significant amount of public attention to that issue. We were seeing spills around the country. And it's amazing what a disaster like that can really do to get the public discourse moving and to start to inspire some change. I think when we look at the toxic floodwaters report, and this is sort of a snapshot of the slide that you're looking at now on the screen, we were looking at it in a much more proactive manner. We wanted to look at the available data that is out there that we can access. We bracketed the James River watershed. We looked at the Center for Disease Control's Social Vulnerability Index, and that looks at things like the socioeconomic status, whether folks are below poverty, unemployed, income, education levels, household composition, and whether folks have reliable access to transportation. All of these factors, which can greatly magnify the impact of a spill or a disaster on communities when those spills might happen. We looked at all of the data that we knew was readily available through federal or state regulatory programs, programs like Superfund, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, RCRA, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. We were able to compile a lot of data points and to layer that onto a map with the NOAA sea level rise models, FEMA flood zones, and looking at things like storm surge as well. When you put all those things together, you can start to create a picture of what the risk really looks like. And here's, I really encourage everyone to check out the Toxic Floodwaters report after the session today. I can only share a few slides from that report here, but this is a snapshot of one of the maps that we produced looking at hazardous chemical facilities, Community Right to Know Act data, and you start to see where there are some concentrations of socially vulnerable populations as well as industrial sites where chemicals are being stored, sometimes right near frontline communities. So Richmond, Hampton Road certainly pop out here. If you look towards sort of the center of the map there, and then down towards the mouth of the river. But at the same time, you can see that we've got over 1,000 facilities spanning the whole watershed. If we zoom in really into the Hampton Roads region, this is where we know there's a large population center. And so we weren't all that surprised to see this is an area where there is likely more concern, more risk. If we, that's all right, you can go on to the next slide. If we start to put all of this information together, this slide provides a helpful snapshot, I think, of what we're looking at different categories of hurricane as far as number of facilities exposed. There on the left, figure 1, and then figure 2, industrial facilities exposed to significant rainfall events. So we're not just talking about coastal areas that are subject to storm surge or hurricanes more frequently. We're talking also about those more upland areas, cities like Richmond, Lynchburg, which are not in tidal areas, but certainly will be subject to flooding as we see increased rainfall and those threats associated with climate change. So we found over 17,000 state and federal regulated facilities through this analysis. We really focused in on about 2,700 facilities that are in the communities with the highest level of social vulnerability. because again, we wanted to think about how we can cater to the needs and the policy reform that's really necessary to address those most at risk. I know we're going to talk a lot more about toxic floodwaters and some solutions to these tremendous problems. So I just want to kind of pause there, I guess, offer you this teaser to the Toxic Floodwaters report, and excited to pick this up and talk more about that later in the panel.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Jordan, you know, in Houston, obviously for many of us that are just watching storms and climate, you know, our eyes have been glued on Houston now for years. So what can you tell us about your experience as a waterkeeper there, you know, particular incidents, and again, you know, how you go about your work as a waterkeeper and thinking about and devising strategies to address these climate risks?
Thanks, David, and great to be with all of you today. Again, my name is Jordan Macha. I'm the Executive Director and Waterkeeper for Bayou City Waterkeeper, headquartered here in Houston. And we work throughout the lower Galveston Bay watershed, which you can see here on the map, and it's comprised of 10 counties throughout the greater Houston-Galveston region. So we've got a lot of land and a lot of water in our area. And like other waterkeepers and, you know, Jamie as well, we work to protect and restore these waterways and wetlands, to hold polluters accountable, and work to achieve equitable policy solutions and advance systemic change to benefit everyone who's living within our watershed. So I guess just to give a little 30,000 foot view of our watershed, like I said, we're comprised of 10 counties, and we host the 3rd largest county in the United States and the 4th largest city in the United States. So we have a lot of land, we have a lot of water, but we also have a lot of people. In addition to all of that, we also unfortunately host the largest petroleum chemical complex in the United States. And we host the largest petrochemical manufacturing complex in the world, and that includes manufacturing of synthetic rubber, fertilizers, insecticide. So those produce a lot of toxic chemicals, and there's need for storage, piping, transportation. All of those systems are in place here in Houston. But we also have a lot of really wonderful benefits of living in our region. We have 2 major rivers, over 2,500 miles of bayous, streams, and creeks that run throughout Harris County and throughout the region. And we're also the 2nd most productive estuary in the United States within the Galveston Bay. And so there's a lot to protect, and there's a lot that is really valuable to our communities that live in this region. And we're an urban coastal area, so our experience with climate impacts routinely affect the choices that we make in affecting and addressing the stressors and challenges within our region. We're 30 miles inland, and just like Jamie was saying, we still have all the impacts of hurricanes related to flooding, to wind, to surge. And so these are all things that impact our industrial siting. Next slide, please. This gives a bit of an overview. If you remember the map from the previous slide, all these red dots indicate major industrial siting in Harris County. And Houston and Harris County in general has little to no zoning laws, which allows industry to place themselves near communities and vulnerable ecological sites. So our rivers, our streams in particular. And you can see on this map that a lot of industry, that includes petrochemical facilities, the refineries, metal scrap yards, they are concentrated on the eastern side of town, and usually along one of our bayou systems, such as Buffalo Bayou, Greens Bayou, or the San Jacinto River. And all of these flow into the Houston Ship Channel and into Galveston Bay. It's important to note as well that this portion of Harris County in particular is home to large populations of communities of color. And next slide. Wanted to just kind of show you where those populations are. Both of these show the Black population and Latinx population here in Houston. And as a waterkeeper, the complexities and challenge within our region makes our work to uphold the Clean Water Act and other regulatory laws to restore our riparian corridors and waterways are particularly important. Like I said, we don't only just host the largest petroleum chemical corridor in the United States, but we are also home to one of the largest wastewater systems in the country. We're currently waiting on the finalization of a $2 billion consent decree that will start the improvement of our wastewater systems. David, you mentioned that we're certainly subject to storms and climate impacts given our coastal proximity, and we we're on the wake of Tropical Storm Beta that passed over Houston for the last 3 days. Experienced a lot of water. It was a stage 3 flood, so similar to other floods that we've had consistently over the last 6-7 years. And our wastewater facilities can actually cause some of the most hazardous toxic disasters, particularly for our communities of color. So you can see on this slide that where our Black and Latinx communities reside, this is where major sewage failures occur, and you can also see here where our capital improvement projects are identified and ongoing. Where we don't see the overlap is where these repairs and projects are identified are not happening in these communities of color, or where we're seeing regular problems related to sewage overflows and infrastructure failure. And so what that means when we have major flooding from storms, be it rainfall or hurricane, folks don't know, what is going to be in the waters if they're forced from their home when flooding occurs, and will this be hazardous to their health? So part of our work within as a waterkeeper is mitigating against these harms and future-proofing against these kinds of disasters. And this is critical to the health and sustainability of all of our communities.
Thank you, Jordan. That's really interesting and important. And Victor, you have an interesting vantage as well, right? So you also live and work in Houston. So when you look out your front door, so to speak, literally or figuratively, and you see flooding, or you encounter industrial land use and pollution where you live, as a scholar, a climate and environmental scholar, what connections do you make sort of in your mind between what you see on the ground in terms of these impacts, right? So in other words, what are sort of some of the key policy failures as you see it, perhaps even successes, and how especially has federal policymaking contributed to this problem of climate-driven environmental pollution?
Thank you so much, David, and the other panelists and CPR. Yes, you took words right out of my mouth, because in Hurricane Harvey, I was looking out my front door at the water rising, carrying furniture up. And the term that kept coming up to me was unprecedented. And I think if you want to step out by 30,000 feet, the biggest problem with our federal laws, and this is all of them that deal with environment, disaster regulation, is that they are not designed for a world in which the physical environment is changing. So they were all designed at a time when we thought, more or less, the physical environment was relatively static, right? The water table was always going to be the same. Kinds of rainfall would repeat themselves. If you had a flood, and a 500-year flood, that would be once every 500 years, not once every 2 years or every 3 years. And that failure has shown itself through multiple federal programs. So just to tick off a few, the Federal Emergency Management Act, the related National Flood Insurance Program are charged with mapping flood zones, right? And they are trying to update them, but they really can't even quite keep up. So first of all, even if we had enough money to do that, there would still be a lag. And people don't know when they are in flood danger. I think I saw a story in the New York Times after Hurricane Laura that 26% of the flooding were in areas that were designated as non-flood zones. And so people didn't get insurance to help them with that. When you look at chemicals and chemical spills, most of these facilities are subject to, some of them to the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. Almost all of them are subject to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And yet over the last 20, 30 years, these have failed to keep up with the changing environment that we have. They're designed for static measures. Enforcement has weakened across the federal government, particularly for the Emergency Planning Act. Since 9/11, a lot of information has been hidden. People don't know how to respond. We don't know what chemicals are coming out. We don't know what's happening with these spills. The Clean Water Act, in approving permits for some of these major facilities, it's supposed to assume that it will allow water quality to be met over the next 5 years, but it too has a very difficult time looking into future scenarios, right? And so from 30,000 feet, I mean, one of our biggest problems is that our environment is just not the same, and it's not going to be the same, and it's going to keep changing. I will just show one more picture here from our slideshow. Here you see the number of Superfund National Priority List sites in Harris County. You see, just like you've seen before, most of them are concentrated in the eastern part of Harris County, near communities of color, et cetera. In theory, CERCLA says that all of these sites, when they are remediated, are supposed to be remediated with a permanent solution, right? And the problem in the last 20 years is we've moved away from that and more towards in situ remediation, where the idea is we'll cap them and leave them there. But the problem we saw in Hurricane Harvey is that those caps were breached. The San Jacinto River site was breached. It reported at one point in the water 70,000 parts per million of dioxin, which is many times higher than what should be allowed or what people should be exposed to. And so the big picture, I think, is the problem is realizing things are changing. You asked for some success stories. Of all of these things, I think FEMA is at least understanding that they are facing disasters they are not used to facing. They have gotten to do a better job of staging. Some local governments and local actors have started to do a better job of preparing. Before the Tropical Storm Beta hit, the one that Jordan referred to, officials from Harris County did go out to try to get a baseline level of exposures from major facilities so that they could tell if there had been a problem or if a breach had occurred. So that's an example of local government being able to come in and do something to assist with that. But of course, all these things take resources, and they take money, and they take time. So I'll stop with that for now.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Victor. And those local and state solutions become all the more difficult in places, I'm sure, like Houston, where obviously you deal with loss after loss and increased costs related just to the disaster recovery and restoration. And so to get ahead of the issue becomes, I'm sure, all the more difficult without federal intervention and resources. But of course, obviously, local and state governments are acting, and Jordan and Jamie, as waterkeepers, I'm aware, perhaps many of our participants are aware that that you all collaborate, nationally with Waterkeeper Alliance on federal policy advocacy, but at the same time, you're working within the states where your programs are located with other keepers there and other environmental advocates to seek out those state and local policy solutions. So my next question for you both, and maybe we'll do Jordan first and then Jamie, is how have you and your allies, in part of your watershed or statewide, how have you addressed these regulatory gaps through advocacy at the state level?
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunately tends to be very reactionary. In Texas, it's widely known that polluters often go unpunished, or they're left unpunished until they create disasters that could have easily been prevented. And often these polluters have not faced enforcement actions, formal or informal, for these violations. An example that when I just thinking about this question that rises for me is in 2019, there was a chemical storage tank owned by International Terminals Company, commonly known as ITC, that had a massive fire that was caused by a chemical leak and resulted in major air and water pollution. And this was not the first time that ITC had violated federal and state law. ITC's Deer Park facility had faced formal enforcement action only once over the last 5 years, despite its repeated water violations. And that one enforcement action only resulted in an $18,000 fine. And in the case of ITC, the Texas Attorney General could and should have acted much sooner to prevent the major disaster that eventually occurred. So slap on the wrist fines really are not enough to force habitual offenders to clean up their act. It just gets rolled into the cost of doing business. I remember when I was working on in New Orleans and in Louisiana during the BP oil spill, and we were waiting and waiting to hear what the penalties were going to be. And you know, the $20 billion penalties that BP received certainly seems like a lot of money, but when you think about their total revenue over even just 1 year, even those massive fines come off as seeming like slap on the wrist. And so, like I said, it gets rolled into the cost of doing business, and it makes our job that much harder to just get enforcement for the regulatory laws that are on the books to be enforced, let alone improving those regulations so that all pollution is addressed. So here in Texas, we're working with our partners and our allies and communities to call on the Attorney General's office to stop shirking its duty to enforce environmental action, because only tougher and more vigorous enforcement will force violators like ITC and other facilities across our region to invest in better infrastructure and hazard mitigation as well.
Jamie, how about in Virginia? You know, and Jordan, you know, I'm sure obviously under the circumstances, you know, enforcement has only become more difficult over the past few years, and a greater priority for you and your partners at especially in the affected communities and frontline fence line communities in Houston. Jamie, can you tell us a little bit about any policy successes you've had in Virginia, and you know, and especially how you know, engaging communities in that work sort of factored into your advocacy strategy and success?
Yeah, thanks, David. And I've actually got two more just simple slides to kind of go along with this segment too. Picking up a bit of what I mentioned earlier in the panel, we had a pretty massive spill, a Bakken crude oil train derailment in Lynchburg at the upper end of the watershed there in 2014. And that really kicked off a lot of attention to the issue of crude oil by rail. But it just so happens that in the same time frame, you know, round about that period of 2014, we had a string of other spills in our region. We had a chemical storage tank rupture and empty its contents into the Elk River in West Virginia, and shut down the drinking water for the capital city of Charleston while legislators were in session, no less. That was a very high profile spill that got national attention. And then of course we had the Dan River coal ash spill, a break in a underlying sort of a stormwater pipe below a coal ash pond, and that emptied its contents into the Dan River in Virginia and down into North Carolina. So we looked at what was happening following the Bakken crude oil, and we realized that we had not only a significant problem with the oil trains going through our watershed, but if we use those other two spills as examples of sort of gaps, regulatory gaps or risks, we quickly recognized we had the very same issues going on in our watershed with millions of tons of coal ash stored at facilities from the headwaters down to the mouth of the river in Chesapeake, as well as a number of sites that we knew were regulated for hazardous chemicals, where they were likely being stored right next to water bodies without any regulations to prevent spills, to require inspections, reporting, the kind of thing that would really be all about preventing spills in the first place. It is a significant challenge to address these things. And I think there's probably a reason that these are risks today and they haven't already been addressed. I mean, these are really tough topics to address. But when you have a spill, there's unfortunately, what goes along with that is the opportunity to really get your base, get your members, get your communities really active, aware, mobile, speaking to folks at all levels of government and within their communities to really make a difference. If you could move on to the second slide there. So the Dan River spill was a really high profile spill. And we have a lot of coal ash within the James River watershed. Most of what Virginia has stored in the Chesapeake Bay watershed is within the James River watershed, millions of tons of this stuff. And at each of there's three major facilities that are in the James River watershed. None of them have the liners beneath the ponds to prevent the leaching of the toxins into the groundwater. And many of these are either right along the river or in low-lying tidal areas that most certainly would be subject to hurricanes and storm surges down the line. So these are a massive risk that we knew existed. And unfortunately, the federal coal ash rules did not go far enough to really address the problem. As status quo was, these facilities would be capped in place as the cheapest, quickest option. And as Victor already alluded to, the in situ closure, that doesn't address the long-term risk, especially as Victor noted, we know the world around us is changing, and we have to really think about what these facilities will be subject to in the future. We have a success story in Virginia in that in 2019, we did finally pass legislation that is requiring all of these coal ash facilities, storage facilities in the Chesapeake Bay watershed to fully excavate, to recycle a component of the ash, and to move the remainder of the ash to modern lined landfills that would be monitored moving forward. So removing the risk from these unlined pits where they are currently leaking and contaminating groundwater and moving them to areas that are safer over the long term. So it was a tremendous effort. It wasn't a one-year effort. We partnered with the Southern Environmental Law Center, the League of Conservation Voters, Potomac Riverkeeper Network was heavily involved. And it was certainly a sort of a grassroots and a conservation community effort across Virginia to really get this over the finish line. We had study years, we had hard years where we felt like we didn't make a whole lot of progress at the General Assembly, but in 2019, this went through, and we are now in the process of implementing this law. And companies like Dominion Energy are developing their plans to remove this stuff and move it off site. So I think that this motivates me that we can seize the moment when we have the right partnerships and the right folks at the table, and we're really speaking again to the local and the state elected officials that are ultimately going to be making these decisions. And so I think when we can poise ourselves to have the right information in our hands, to be viewed as the lead advocates on an issue like coal ash, we can push very hard, and we can make changes at the regulatory level and at the state level to address potential gaps in federal law.
Great, thank you both. I want to turn back to federal policymaking in our discussion and share another question with you, Victor. I want to also recognize one of the questions that have come in through or comments from one of our participants. First part, Superfund site remedies have 30-year outlooks. That seems like that could be a regulation or a law that might be ripe for reform, right? The other part of that note is that acknowledging, which is absolutely the case, I know this to be the case, that EPA is working across programs and regions to begin studying or continue studying climate vulnerability of regulated industrial facilities. And so, with that work underway, right, and also Victor, especially I think some of the work that under the last administration, the Obama administration, not just with climate policy making, but also within EPA, the executive order that led to programmatic level adaptation planning. I'm wondering, from your perspective, if there's a transition in the administration, right, and an opportunity for reform, given the static nature of these regulatory programs, perhaps even the siloed nature of them, do you envision, or do you think there's an opportunity for a more holistic approach to, to implement or design adaptation reforms across major programs? Is there something entirely different that we should undertake at the federal level?
That's a great question. And I think it is important to note that despite pushback from the Trump administration, there continues to be work that moves along that looks at adaptation from multiple agencies. Although it is in fits and starts precisely because of the Trump administration's, at least the political part of the Trump administration's antipathy towards climate science. So for instance, under CERCLA, there was just a report released from the Superfund Task Force, Superfund Improvement Task Force, which was to try to look at how both remedies could be made more efficient and how vulnerable communities could be protected. Great things to look at, et cetera. But because of the political pressures that were on them, they were not able to look at the situation of remedies that might not last long enough for the changes that are coming in the environment. To their credit, though, when these things are brought to their attention, they are at least attempting, to the extent they are allowed, to look at these things. And as you pointed out in the Obama administration, there was an interagency task force that was created to look at climate change adaptation across all levels of government. The military has been particularly successful at this in a way that a lot of the rest of the federal infrastructure has not, although a good start was made. To answer your question about is there something completely new, I'm going to throw something out there. It's not completely new, but it would be completely new to the federal government. So in 2010, the state of North Carolina passed a law that said every state agency needs to review its programs and its regulatory, or the parties it regulates, to see if those programs need to be changed or updated because of climate change impacts. That's very broad, right? Very open-ended. I happened to be at the University of North Carolina at the time in our Center for Law, Environment, Adaptation, and Resources. And it actually was a great project for us because we were trying to figure out how to make something like that actually come into being. And one of the things we figured out was that we basically needed to look at things that climate routinely impacts, right? Like drought, flooding, agriculture, heat, fires, habitat, all of these things, and just kind of create a checklist. And then that checklist would be assigned to one person in the agency who's with help from volunteer students, whose job was to go through all the regulatory programs and see if any of these things were involved in the regulatory programs. If they were to go and look at those and look at potential ways to change those or alter them or change them for something that's a more dynamic environment. And it's hard to imagine we could pass something like that at the federal level. But honestly, I think a comprehensive idea, the idea that all of our agencies, and this is not just environmental, but all of our agencies really need to see where they're going to be in the next 5 to 10 years with our climate and physical environment changing, and particularly for our environmental efforts, what they are going to do to try to improve those. So that's a big picture. Just to back up a little bit, I would say even just providing more enforcement, more more funding to assist with these things, I think also would be a big help.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And you know, I like how you make the point, or emphasize the point, Victor, about you know, other agencies, right? Whether that's the federal level or the state level, not just the environmental regulatory agencies, have a, you know, of course, have a responsibility to address climate impacts. But I think in particular, when it comes to disaster policy in response to, you know, major chemical disasters and environmental pollution, absolutely. It is a multi-agency effort, and one in which they all need to be involved, not just on sort of the prevention end, so to speak, when it comes to, you know, environmental regulators, but also those agencies that are there to help mitigate harm, right, to affected communities.
Yeah, if I could just interrupt a comment about that. I think one of the things we have really learned in this spate of massive disasters that we've seen, certainly in the Houston area, but also I think around the country, and is that because we have been paying attention, because we have seen more of these and we're preparing more for these, we realize how much these disasters do create secondary hazards, or well, primary hazards, right? Of these release of chemicals in the water, in the air. You know, 30 years ago, we didn't necessarily have as much data about that, or didn't really see how much that was going to affect people. Now we really do know that. And that makes it puts the onus on disaster response to be aware of that, certainly. I think one of the chats noted how some of the first responders were exposed to massive chemicals after Hurricane Harvey. That is absolutely right. But also it behooves the other regulatory agencies that are supposed to manage these risks, right? Sites that are producing toxic materials who would have waste, to ensure that they are contained in a better way as well. So I think it works in both of these. It works both for the regulatory agencies, who should be upping their game and requiring more, and with the disaster and first responders themselves.
Excellent. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit more about communities, right? And again, sort of, I want to give a question to both you, Jordan, and Jamie. Again, you know, as water keepers, right, you have community engagement strategies, right? That's part of your work. Engaging them in the work that you do, communicating hazards to them, involving folks in advocacy. So I'm wondering if, you know, if there's something different about, you know, climate-driven water pollution and the risks that those pose to communities than sort of perhaps something that's, you know, sort of divorced from climate, but a water pollution threat. Do you have a different approach to how you go about communicating those risks and engaging communities? You know, is it something as sort of close as working with those communities to identify those risks and solutions? And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work in that space.
Yeah, I can jump in and go first, David. So yeah, I think that our organizations can, you know, play a major role in catalyzing some change with data, with the latest science. You know, when we're able to pull together reports that can really help us get pointed in a particular direction and quantify and understand a risk associated with climate change. If we can couple that information with the real challenges that people are facing on the ground that we're hearing about, then we have a complete message. Then we can start to really talk to lawmakers, talk to local governments, and talk about solutions. And I think that's where water keepers can play a really important role. You know, I'll say that a lot of times, you know, not just flooding issues and chemical releases, but a lot of times we'll hear about issues from community volunteers or community members before we know about them ourselves as water keepers. That's been my experience. We sort of have eyes and ears on the ground in a lot of communities around the watershed, because at the end of the day, we're, you know, Jordan and I are one person, and we really have to utilize those community leaders that we know are out there. So, I'm thinking of a group in Southeast Newport News that I've had the pleasure to get to know a little bit over time, that is right up against, a export station. And they're faced with noise, air pollution, and a lot of tangible threats that they can communicate. How do they communicate the unknown though? How do they advocate for themselves when there isn't really clear information out there about the chemical facilities around them, what the real effect of sea level rise is going to have on that particular community? And so I think that is an important role that we can play, is to get out there and to try to link communities with the information that we do have, and to make them try to empower those people to really be advocates for themselves and for the river. So I really think that that information has to rise through all levels of our local and state government, though, to really make progress. We've got to have the science, and we've got to have the the human dimension of this challenge to really understand the tangible problem and make adaptation and preventing chemical spills, to make that a priority.
Yeah, Jamie, I think that was a really good overview of our approach as well, and especially serving as those technical and policy expertise. But those most at risk, especially those living on the fence line of major industry, they deeply understand the pollution and climate risks that are facing their community. So for us, our work as advocates and allies is to ensure that we're listening, and that we're working to ensure that their voices are heard and brought to the decision-making table. For us in the Gulf South and the greater Houston area, we are constantly having this conversation about how we can protect ourselves from climate impacts. And this is a critical conversation. Hurricane seasons are becoming stronger, and they're becoming much more impactful earlier and later throughout the season. It's hard to believe we're already on the second round of naming storms within this season already. And we're at the end of September, and October and November, unfortunately, we can still expect to possibly see more storms hitting our region. So taking the time, talking and listening to communities about what their immediate needs are, and providing that opportunity for a community-centered framework to approach these challenges is something that we found is really successful in getting community buy-in and, like Jamie said, empowering folks to go and be able to speak to decision makers with authority, and providing that space. And if we're setting up the meeting, we're allowing community members to take leadership and lead on what the challenges they have, and also providing those solutions that they see are most immediately necessary in their community. Also, we want to be able to provide additional insight on these innovative designs, like nature-based solutions that can help buffer impacts. So working together as a team, but really allowing community to lead, we found has been a successful strategy to get our decision makers to listen, especially those elected decision makers. And then on the agency side, providing that connection so that we can brainstorm and think about how we future-proof against traumatic disasters.
Right. Yeah. And that's really helpful. I also, I'm thinking about how, Victor, we talked about the need for different agencies and government to be working together and thinking about these particular threats, climate-driven pollution and disaster. And I think the same is the case for the public interest sector, right? That there are connections that must be made between the water advocacy community or the environmental advocacy community and other public interest sectors that are focused perhaps on other community level needs. And so I'm actually reminded of that in particular by one of the comments in the Q&A box. Richard mentions that workers who clean up after storms are exposed to the toxic waters, and that he saw that after Hurricane Harvey. And it reminds me actually of an earlier webinar discussion we had at CBR with Saket Soni from Resilience Force, who works with workers in in Florida, among immigrant marginalized communities that are going in after the storms to repair homes. And so I'm thinking that there are important connections to be made there as well, you know, with immigration advocates, of course, and workers' rights advocates on these very issues. So I want, before we jump into our Q&A, and folks feel free to type in some questions there into that box, I want to give our webinar participants something to walk away with, in a sense. And so, you know, whether that's someone who's a community advocate or for another keeper working at a regional or state scale, and perhaps even something for regulators to be thinking about in terms of sort of engaging citizens in this work. Can you recommend one particular strategy or project, you know, if that's regulatory advocacy or litigation or something different, monitoring, that you think could help provide some value in preventing or reducing the harm of climate-driven pollution within the communities where you work? And so, if I'd like all three of you to answer that question. So I'm gonna, Jordan, if I could ask you to go first.
Sure, thanks. I think for the first thing that comes to mind, and it tails onto what I was talking about earlier, is to work to ensure that industry first pays for their own protection. Public dollars should not be utilized to provide basic first line protections from hurricane and major storms to industrial facilities. And we're facing this in Houston right now. There's a proposal for a coastal barrier system that is being proposed by the Army Corps of Engineers and certainly supported in various ways by our local and state governments to protect the petroleum chemical corridor without first requiring that they bolster their own facilities to ensure their own protection. And oftentimes these, quote, silver bullet solutions can cause more significant harm both to the environment. This particular project has major risk to completely destroy the ecology and ecosystem of Galveston Bay, which in turn would harm livelihoods and the economies that rely on those waters and natural resources. But it's also coming at the cost of public tax dollars and public dollars in general, where those monies can be served to help move people out of harm's way, to help bolster against climate-driven impacts. So continuing this call across the country for industries to provide their own first line of protection against chemical climate impacts can allow these industries to take personal responsibility for pollution and allow public dollars to be spent on keeping people out of harm's way.
Interesting. What do you think, Victor?
Well, one thing, just if you're talking about one thing a local group can do, I was reminded when we were talking about the problems, this doesn't deal with all chemical sites, but with Superfund sites, for instance. When Superfund remedies are selected, the local organizations are supposed to be consulted. And in fact, there's money in that for them to be consulted. So I think one thing that can be done is to make sure that your community participates in opportunities to select remedies for cleanup and various other things, and to hold their feet to the fire to say you're going to be protected, and to note that things can change. And how are you going to be protected if there is a weather event, a climate event of some other nature? So that's one thing I can think of off the top of my head.
Excellent. What are you thinking, Jamie?
Well, first, I want to agree with Jordan that who pays is pretty important. And as a quick aside, this issue of unregulated above ground chemical storage tanks, we spent a lot of time discussing this with lawmakers in Virginia and some regulated individuals as well. And that's exactly the approach we were trying to take, is have those facilities pay for the monitoring, the inspections, the oversight of the regulatory agencies. That's got to be a critical feature, I think, of addressing a lot of these problems, because so often we hear this argument that that it's going to bankrupt the agency that has to implement it. Well, it's part of the cost of doing business for a lot of these industrial facilities, and I think that has to be a key component of it, who pays. But the main point I think I want to make in kind of conclusion of what we do now is, I don't think there's any one thing, but there's, I was guilty earlier of having a bunch of acronyms in one of those slides. And for waterkeepers and policy folks on the call, maybe that's fine. But we have to do a lot of education to really understand, for communities to really understand what we're talking about. Not that we want everybody to be able to talk about NIPDs and Community Right to Know Act like it's their second nature. But we do have to again empower communities to be able to speak during these comment periods when a facility is being considered for a permit or going through a renewal process. That might be a key time to talk about some of these issues. And if we don't have community members that are involved in that, our voice is just much weaker, in my opinion. So something that was in the Toxic Floodwaters report is a citizen's guide to a lot of these federal programs, federal and state programs, just to get a more basic understanding of what they're all about and how they're regulated and what information they make available to the public. That's just a start, but I think we've got to get this information out to communities so that they can better understand how to speak for themselves and be involved in these decisions.
David, before we completely go from this, I just have to add one more thing. When I think about how important it is to work with local groups and yet how they have to interact with federal rules and regulations, I'm reminded that if there's an intermittent way to get funding, these groups need funding essentially to help them do that. And the model that I look at is the Coastal Zone Management Act, which basically says if you have a coastal zone and you plan in that coastal zone, the federal government and meet, have community involvement, et cetera, you'll be given money to assist you in doing that planning. Some states have done it better than others, but we could have a climate risk impact zone law or a climate flood risk impact zone law or a climate flood chemical facility risk impact zone. I mean, again, this is, thinking out of the box a little bit, but we can't just look at the federal government do stuff without having some way that the federal government connects more and provides funding through a state to, I think, local groups as well.
Excellent. That's a great idea. So we're coming up on the end of the hour, and we've got a couple of interesting, perhaps a little bit tough questions still unanswered. If we can't get to them, we'll provide written answers following the webinar. The first question kind of gets at this issue of for affected waters and communities, which of these sort of waters at risk of chemical spill are actually sources of drinking water for the communities where they're located. And obviously that's going to be different from watershed to watershed. And, that seems to me to be just one of those other additional factors or variables that are part of sort of the research and analysis, and of course, like communications that waterkeepers and others have to undertake, right, to sort of tease out where the risks are for these particular issues. So one more question before we end. Victor, can you speak to the industry creating fake community groups advocating for less effective remedies at Superfund cleanups?
Sure. I won't necessarily use the term fake. I'll use alternative. And I'm not doing that because I'm trying to say they're not fake in whatever way people think about them. But in any situation where you have community opposition to anything like Superfund cleanup, citing new chemical facilities, industrial facilities, oftentimes you're also going to have that industry who wants those things to happen, right, trying to figure out some advocates for them, right? And that could be part of the same community. It could be different leaders in that community, right? Sometimes there are promises of better jobs, right? Or sometimes there are promises of more tax money, based money for the government, for something like that. So even without getting to just the fake groups where they're literally hiring people to go in and comment, you often have a divergence, which is fueled by the industrial organization attempting to try to make its best case in whatever way we can do that. And I think, honestly, you know, the trying to control that runs into speech issues, free speech issues in certain ways. And I think the best way to get to that is to be aware of it and to make sure that people are aware of who supports what, right? Who are these people that are speaking for this side? Why are they speaking for this side? You know, is it because they sincerely have this belief? Looking at the final remedy for the San Jacinto waste pits, one of the arguments made by the responsible parties there is, well, we don't want to move this, right, to dispose of it in a manner that's far away because we'll create risk to the community by digging it up. That's not completely false. but it doesn't necessarily look at what that risk means vis-a-vis the risk of leaving it there. And, you know, unless organizations, civic organizations are empowered and have that knowledge, they can't do it. So I see this really as a role for our local NGOs, you know, being on top of this, making sure that people know, and being able to use the press in that way too, so that the press knows who's representing whom. Right? What are their interests? And just designating them for what those interests particularly are.
Excellent. Thank you, Victor. Well, that wraps up our webinar and our hour. I want to thank our panelists, Jamie, Jordan, and Victor, again for joining us, and all of you, our participants, for joining us as well. As I mentioned, I hope you will receive an email after this webinar with a survey. We ask that you please complete the survey. Please look out for a recording of this webinar, which I hope you will share with your colleagues, as well as an announcement for the next webinar series, again, which is going to be on October 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern, focus on environmental justice and environmental health impacts. So thank you once again, everyone, and have a great remainder of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.